The isekai genre sucks. Kind of. I think a more accurate, albeit less attention-grabbing way of saying that is that no shows that I've seen have properly used the premise to its fullest potential. The only show to truly come close is Re:Zero, but even that show doesn't particularly make the reincarnation truly that interesting or important. Re:Zero puts an interesting spin on it, sure, but would the show truly be all that different if it had just been a fantasy from the get-go? And more importantly, would it even be any worse? Today, we're going to be taking a look at a show that truly uses the reincarnation premise to tell a story that could not be told without it. So allow me to introduce to you the grandfather of Isekai, Mushoku Tensei. During my 10 years of anime watching, I've seen my fair share of isekai anime. In fact, one of, if not the first anime I watched was Sword Art Online. I was 11 or 12 at the time and I absolutely loved it. But as the number of anime I've watched has increased, the appreciation I have for the isekai genre has decreased. For anybody watching this video who's not familiar with the term, let me give you a quick explanation and trust me, it'll be quick. Isekai translates to alternative world, and it basically encompasses any story where a character is transported from one world, usually the real one, to usually a fantasy world with magic. It's a very interesting premise the first time you see it. My main complaint about the genre is that I haven't really found that most isekai shows benefit from being isekai shows. A lot of the shows that exist within the isekai genre would be pretty much exactly the same if it was just a fantasy show from the beginning. However, with most things, there are exceptions to this. Re:Zero mixed the isekai premise with a sort of Groundhog Day gimmick to create a very dark story as the anime pushed its character to the depths of despair and explored his psyche and trauma. But other than the few exceptions, I've begun to think that the isekai genre exists almost entirely as a way to merely introduce a fantasy world and do nothing else with the possibilities that the genre allows for. Even Re:Zero isn't necessarily safe from that criticism, because if you remove the isekai elements, you get an almost identical story. And because of that, it's been about 6 years since I've had any interest in watching any isekai shows. But about 2 years ago, I had a coworker suggest Mushoku Tensei Jobless Reincarnation. Initially, I refused, but after hearing such good things about it online, I caved. I reluctantly watched the first few episodes, and I was hooked. Thinking back on it, it's kind of difficult to explain why exactly this show hooked me. I know that the way the anime depicted the use of magic felt, well, magical, and the relationships between the characters felt so real. Roxy's departure in the second episode made me emotional, despite only having known the character for barely an episode. But as I continued to watch the show, I began realizing why Mushoku Tensei is so loved, and also why it's so controversial. And that controversy isn't something I can just gloss over because it's not completely without merit. But allow me to explain the story's premise before getting into that. Mushoku Tensei is an isekai, as mentioned previously, and the story begins with the scene of a car crash. It also shows who we will come to know as our main character, dying at the scene. Our main character gets glimpses of another world as he breathes his final breaths. When he eventually does pass away, he immediately wakes up in the arms of a mother who has just given birth. He has just reincarnated as a newborn child, but retained all of his memories of his previous life. This particular aspect of the story is where some of that aforementioned controversy stems from. But like I said, we'll get into that a little bit later. But it's also this previous life that gives Mushoku Tensei the opportunity to tell a very interesting story. Because throughout the story, we continually learn more and more about Rudeus's past life. We learn from the opening scenes of the show that Rudeus was a NEET or an incel or whatever other term you want to use to soften the term loser. He was a 34-year-old when he died, and now has the opportunity to become the person he was never able to be. Instead of browsing Reddit and rotting in his room, Rudeus begins studying books, learning the history of the new world he's found himself in. And thus, we begin the journey that is Rudeus' character development. Very early on in the show, we learn that Rudeus is scared to go outside. This stems from his previous life, where he was made fun of and bullied constantly. We get flashbacks of these events, glimpses of a deep trauma that led Rudeus to the lifestyle and worldview he previously held, and he's afraid of that happening again. But through the first 2 episodes, he learns to overcome that fear. It takes time, a lot of time, and it takes a lot of help. But he eventually does move past the fences of trauma that were caging him in, both literally and figuratively. While this is a huge step for Rudy, it's also only the first of many. Rudeus is starting his life with the full weight of an entire life's worth of trauma, habits, and beliefs, and many of these habits are unhealthy, toxic, or outright predatory. In Rudeus' previous life, he spent plenty of time online and had little to no interaction with any real women. This led him to developing addictions and habits I'll let you figure out for yourself, and these habits largely go unchecked by his new family because he's a baby. And as he grows into a toddler, his weird behavior is just seen as that of an innocent child, even though it's anything but. Rudeus knows this, and he takes advantage of it. It's the first time in the show we realize just how deeply flawed our main character actually is, and trust me, it won't be the last. A lot of people feel uncomfortable due to Rudeus' actions and his generally hormonal nature. The criticisms from Mushoku Tensei's detractors are at least somewhat understandable, but as with most opinions on the internet, they tend to take it a little bit too far. Rudeus is not a morally perfect character. You're not supposed to agree with or support everything he does. The story is about the development of Rudeus and his battle against his old mindsets. The criticisms that people have made of Mushoku Tensei can all essentially be explained as, if you enjoy this show, you endorse the actions of the main character. Now, I want to make it clear that it's totally fine and totally understandable if Rudy's actions and mindsets make you uncomfortable enough that you can't justify watching the show. But if there are themes and elements of a story that you are too uncomfortable with, you need to understand that not everyone else will be made as uncomfortable by those themes as you. Or at least they may be willing to push through that discomfort. That doesn't mean they endorse the character's actions. I have friends who self-insert into every piece of media they ingest, and if they aren't able to relate almost entirely to a character, they just won't watch a show. I don't do that. If a character has attributes or struggles that I can relate to, obviously I'll relate in those areas. But I don't try to make my life fit into every story I ingest. I think the differences between people who try to self-insert and those who don't may be part of the key to understanding this controversy. I enjoy figuring out the broader picture and themes of the story. If Rudy is acting creepy, why is he doing it? How does it make sense for him as a character? And probably more importantly, why is the author writing him this way? What is the message the story is trying to get across? I don't think it's wrong to try and insert yourself into a story. I just think it's a difference on how people enjoy media. But making damn near libelous claims about a show's viewers and or its author is nothing more than intellectually dishonest virtue signaling. Notice that I'm defending Mushoku Tensei as a story and its right to be told, but not Rudeus as a person. Rudeus is a creepy, perverted freak, but that doesn't mean his story shouldn't be allowed to be told. If you want to say that Mushoku Tensei should be cancelled, then we'll have to get rid of Goodnight Pun Pun Homunculus and Berserk as well. And then where do we draw the line? If Doflamingo is my favorite villain from One Piece, does that mean I endorse all the decisions that he made? Should One Piece be cancelled? Should Hunter x Hunter not be allowed to exist purely because of the existence of Hisoka? If you like Hunter x Hunter, does that mean you support the actions of Hisoka? Obviously, the answer to these questions is no. You're not a racist for liking Ghetto from JJK. You're not an anti-Semite for liking Attack on Titan. Because it's totally possible to enjoy a show and disagree with some of the actions of some of the characters. That's the point of stories. Mushoku Tensei is about overcoming bad mindsets and old habits. Is putting these habits on display really such a problem? There's no point in writing a story of redemption if a character is perfect from the beginning. Mushoku Tensei has its fair share of inappropriate moments, but I don't think these moments are nearly at the level of pure degeneracy as High School DxD, High School of the Dead, or any other brain-dead ecchi anime. Mushoku Tensei is a mature show in every sense of the word, but not only does Mushoku Tensei depict mature imagery, as many other shows do, but it handles those mature scenarios with an immense amount of self-restraint. These scenes are awkward and uncomfortable, and as much as Mushoku Tensei tends to make inappropriate and sexually oriented jokes, the actual scenes that depict these encounters take a much darker and more serious tone. They're almost never celebrated, with maybe one exception I can think of off the top of my head, and they leave lasting impacts on our character. As much as he chases and desires pleasure, it never actually leaves him fulfilled. In fact, the first of these scenarios in the show leaves Rudeus devastated. It affects him for most of the following season, both physically and mentally. Now, I haven't read the light novels, so I'm going purely based off the events and trajectory of the anime, and it's totally possible that Rudeus proves to be irredeemable and that the author is just using this story to project his strange fantasies out into the world. But I would never seriously claim that, because even if Rudeus refuses to change, I think there's still something to learn from him. A major theme of the show is actions and consequences. He struggles against this constantly, and if the author truly wanted nothing more to express his strange fantasies, I find it hard to believe he would have written the story and the characters the way he has. Mushoku Tensei could have filled itself with endless amounts of fan service and could celebrate all of Rudy's actions, but it doesn't. There are problematic behaviors that we all struggle with. There are things we all do that we know we shouldn't, and there are even most likely behaviors in our lives that we aren't even aware of that we need to fix. Mushoku Tensei should make you aware of at least some of those things. Don't try morally grandstanding me or the viewers of this show, because you'll fall into just the same trap that Rudy has found himself in. Pride is the most dangerous sin of all, and Rudeus has consistently been shown the ramifications of it, but it's yet another character flaw that Rudeus has, and it remains to be seen if it's one that will change or not. Season 2 saw Rudeus encounter a lot of things that humbled him. Mushoku Tensei succeeds as an isekai precisely because our main character is written the way he is. He's given another opportunity at life, but still struggles with the same things he did in the past. Mushoku Tensei uses the isekai premise to introduce interesting conflict throughout the series, both with other people who have experienced the same thing as our main character, as well as with himself. But we also see these conflicts within this new life Rudeus has as well. While Rudeus is struggling against his past mindsets, trying desperately not to be like his old self, only to fail regularly, he also tries to avoid ending up like his new father, Paul, someone he had very little respect for because of his actions, only to fail at that also. By the end of Season 2, Rudeus has become almost entirely like his new father. Dichotomy, contrast, change, opportunity, confusion, and redemption are theoretically what the isekai genre is literally designed to show. But those things can't just be in the first episode. They should permeate the plot and tell a truly impossible story. Mushoku Tensei crafted the mold from which a vast majority of its successors would be cast, and yet it includes so much more than other isekai stories that it feels as if it's breaking that very mold. The story includes so many twists that left my jaw agape that it made me wonder why no other shows I've seen have included them. Without spoiling anything, the moment I'm thinking about specifically here is the reveal of Nanahoshi's true identity. The way they switched between human tongue and Japanese was such an incredible way of introducing a completely new aspect and mystery of the story. Why has no other story I've seen included a similar plot point? I'm willing to accept the fact that I could be missing out on shows that do include this, but it completely turned everything I thought possible about isekai shows on its head. Mushoku Tensei stands out beyond its peers because it seems to be the only show that truly recognizes that it's an isekai and fully understands how to use that premise to its advantage to tell a unique story. Before watching Mushoku Tensei, I wasn't even aware of how many possibilities there were for storytelling within the genre. I figured isekai shows just wanted some way to introduce a new world, and I never understood why they wouldn't just make it a fantasy story to begin with. But Mushoku Tensei truly could not be told if it were just a regular fantasy story. It opened my eyes to the possibility of the genre and generated a pretty significant amount of interest within me to watch more of these stories. I'm not sure if any other story will get it right, but I can't say that I'm not curious.